Chapter 2 talks about the rediscovery of crime victims. And it's basically looking at how do crime victims start to be recognized by the system more. So let's start by thinking about victims in the first place. The word victim in ancient times is connected to this idea of sacrifice, and it often referred to a person or animal put to death in a ceremony to appease some deity or supernatural power. Over the centuries, it's picked up different meanings, and today we really think about, as we discussed in chapter 1, individuals who experience injury, loss, or hardship for any reason. It also includes, as I mentioned previously, accidents, diseases, natural disasters, social problems, and crime. So in the past, in ancient times, up until maybe the last couple hundred years, victims played a leading role in the resolution of criminal matters. So basically, victims were really responsible for seeking out and bringing charges against people who had harmed them or dealing with it personally. In order to discourage then retaliation by victims, basically to discourage feuding, they established these direct repayment plans, and you would receive money or valuables. So this victim-oriented justice occurred mostly in small villages where there were close ties that binded each individual to the other. As we start to begin to industrialize, we see formation of business relationships and the victim's role diminishes. So the seriousness of wounds and losses becomes important, but only for determining charges and punishment. Restoring victims to their original condition is no longer important, and that becomes handled in another court. So as I mentioned, historically, criminal justice focused on victims seeking redress for pain and suffering based upon not only biblical tenets, but common law in England. Victims, as we know, during industrialization, they lose control to government in a judicial process. And so recovery of damages then, right, say you want to seek restitution, that can often become a civil matter rather than a criminal matter. We think of this when we think about tort law. So if somebody were to damage your fence, you could take them to court over that to seek damages. In the United States, the history is pretty similar. In colonial America, victims did their own investigations. They paid for warrants in order for a sheriff to make an arrest. And then the Bill of Rights reconceptualizes crime. So as we have the American Revolution, we start to see crime as a wrong against the state. In criminal law, this may often be talked about as a violation of the Queen's peace. And so we start to see a focus now on protecting the rights of criminals. And that comes from our history with British when we were a colony. So violation of laws becomes the focus as opposed to what harm is caused to the actual individual. The prosecutors in courts then become focused on deterring crime. And how are they going to deter crime? Through punishment, long sentences, and the use of execution. So prosecutors then are given powers and duties that were previously the responsibility of victims. So the victim's role becomes twofold at this point. You go into the police and file a complaint if you've been a victim of a crime, and you may need to testify for the prosecution if necessary. A victim essentially today is another witness. Okay, so the crime is against the state. If you were to break the law here in Massachusetts, it would be the Commonwealth of Massachusetts versus you, and the victim is another witness. They're not notified or involved with plea bargaining. They generally don't have any say in that. In the late 50s and 60s, though, we start to see some social movements that really influence this idea that victims are being, quote unquote, rediscovered. We see three movements here. So let's talk a little bit about each of them. The Law and Order movement comes about during the 60s where there's a surge in crime. And so basically this movement is a reaction to these rising crime rates. People are worried about victimization, and the idea is let's get tough on crime, and that's supposed to somehow help victims. So this is a hardline conservative stance that the average American should be more worried about becoming a victim than unfairly being prosecuted and convicted. They want swift, sure punishment free of loopholes. When they talk about loopholes, they're talking about, you often hear someone will say someone got off on a quote unquote technicality, right? So that's those rights that you have as an accused, your civil liberties, and anyone who is opposed to this sort of get tough approach, which has been dominant for a long time now, was really seen as being pro-criminal. The women's movement begins in the 70s, and we start to see the first rape crisis center. The first one occurs in Washington, D.C., the second one is actually here in Massachusetts. The Boston Area Rape Crisis Center opens the very beginning of January 1973. We see a safe house for battered women. So we start to see efforts at breaking down patriarchal culture and how that has impacted women. So we start to see this becoming very active anti-rape, anti-battering campaigns. And so, of course, that has a strong focus then on victims. And what is the victim's role in the system? And what rights and protections does a victim have? And then we see a whole series of other social movements. Rights of children, focus on senior citizens, rights of the LGBT community, better training for law enforcement, concerns about prisoners' rights. And so all of this has really brought our attention back to victims of crime. Then a thing that becomes very popular is we start to name legislation after victims, especially high-profile crime victims. And whenever possible, we often see this with names of children. So the Brady Bill is named after James Brady. He was shot during the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan. The Amber Alert is named after a girl named Amber, and Megan's Law. Well, there's Megan's Laws, right? So every state has their own version of Megan's Law. Also, that's named after Megan Kanka, K-A-N-K-A. All colleges are required to gather, report, and release to their college community the last 3 years of campus crime statistics. That was referred to as the Cleary Act, and that's named after Jean Cleary, who was a victim at Lehigh University of a crime. The Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Crime Act, Matthew Shepard and James Byrd, those are both victims in 1993 of hate crimes. The most recent federal sex offender law is the Adam Walsh Child Protection Act. But if you look at it, it's actually named after 29 victims, 28 of whom are child victims of sexual assault, and one is a woman who is a young woman, but not a child. So the media plays a big role here too, right? So how do we know about these incidents? We know about them from the media. So we start to see a lot of attention given to victims as opposed to offenders in media coverage. These highly publicized cases give victims a forum to be heard. And because we have this 24-hour news cycle, we get news around the clock. Breaking news, we don't have to wait for the news to come on. It'll scroll across the bottom of your screen. And even more than that, now we get an alert on our phone through Twitter, if you have a news app. So I think I have CNN and Channel 7 for local news, right? And it's constantly beeping up some alert of some, some newsworthy event that has just happened. So the media's right, though, to report crimes often conflicts with, if you're a victim, how much privacy are you entitled to? So what are some ways that we've addressed that? Well, one is through what's called shield laws. These are laws that protect someone from needless and unnecessary disclosure of names and addresses. So, for instance, we often hear about this in regards to rape shield law, that the media will not report the name of a rape victim. We also rely on reporters and editors to use their own restraint in terms of thinking about a victim's right to privacy, and whether or not they have their own codes of ethics, requiring them to read a victim their victim rights prior to any interviews. So if you've ever watched any coverage, of which I'm sure you all have, sometimes we see, the media in the aftermath of Columbine, is interviewing kids, high school students. Is that okay? Should there be any protections sort of in place there? Today, we also have the issue of, self-reporting. So people, so you see something newsworthy happening in your community, you post a picture or some video footage on Twitter or Facebook, you might find out that a news agency has contacted you asking you if they can use that footage. We also then have businesses cashing in on fear of becoming a crime victim, right? So how many things or how many devices have you purchased? So most cars, I think today, probably come with an alarm system, but do they really work? I can tell you that my neighbor next door, their car alarm went off repeatedly the other day. It went off, it would stop, it went off, it would stop pretty much all day long. I'm not sure if they weren't home. And while nobody was trying to steal the car, nobody really seemed concerned that the alarm was going off either. Home security systems, pepper spray, firearms. We've got a whole market out there of different things that you can buy to help protect yourself. Tracking devices. So So victimologists play a major role here then in this process of rediscovery. So stage 1 calls attention to a problem that we've overlooked for a while. Stage 2, you're starting to win victories, you're starting to implement reforms. Stage 3, we see the emergence of an opposition, right? So people who are going to oppose what you're trying to do, resistance to any further changes. And then we see research and resolution of disputes. So let's look at one. Let's look at the concept of human trafficking, right? So this is an issue that's sort of a hot topic now, but this has been a long-standing problem, okay? So the first stage is to revive public outrage about a long-standing issue that people have sort of put on the back burner or kind of forgot about. So we see this come through a lot of feminists, feminism movements, and conservative evangelical Christians. They join together and they're trying to heighten concern and provoke outrage with regards to human trafficking. And we think about human trafficking, we generally think about commercial sexual exploitation. Then we start to see some legislation passed up. So the State Department broadens the definition of trafficking. All states and the District of Columbia have passed laws to combat sex and labor trafficking, but most states still don't have adequate laws to support and assist people who escape human trafficking. There are still many states who, if a girl is a minor and she's been trafficked, but she's quote unquote working as a prostitute, that she will often be arrested or punished for being a prostitute, even though she may be below the age of consent, which makes her a victim. So we see challenges arise. Some activists feel the casual application of the term modern day slavery is insensitive. It's not accurate. There's concern about sensationalism. And then there's always, when these challenges arise, some people who say, well, you're really exaggerating the problem. So then what we do is we find some research, right? So once we've had a policy in place or we're rediscovering something, we can do some more research about it. So we have confirmed victims. Studies have found that police departments lack sufficient policies or adequate training to accurately identify trafficking victims. And you can see here with these citations, we have quite a bit of research. And this research ends at 2012, but we know we have more current research. And that wraps up this chapter.